I'm Charles Pink, president of the OSS Society, and on its behalf, I'm pleased to welcome you to the second installment in the OSS Society's 2024 OSO Social Conversation Series, which was created in 2020. The name for this series was inspired by a column written by Drew Pearson, who was the leading Washington columnist of his day. He wrote a column that was critical of General Donovan and the OSS. And in the column, he said that so many members of the OSS were in the social register that its initials really stood for OSO Social. And Pearson owned a farm not far from Congressional Country Club in Maryland that served as an OSS training facility during World War II. As you might imagine, General Donovan didn't take kindly to this slight. And after Pearson's column was published, General Donovan sent a group of OSS commandos who were training at Congressional to raid Pearson's farm, but just for practice. We're honored to bring you leaders from the intelligence and special operations communities to discuss critical national security issues. Tonight, we're very fortunate to have the Honorable Michael Vickers, former Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and the OSS Society's chairman, lead us in a discussion with Lieutenant General Charles Cleveland, who is the former Commanding General of the U.S. Special Operations Command. The OSS Society is indebted to Lieutenant General Cleveland for keeping the OSS legacy alive by creating the modern-day Jedburghs. The focus of tonight's discussion is Lieutenant General Cleveland's RAND report, The American Way of Irregular War, an analytical memoir. We've included links in the chat function to it for you to download the report or to purchase it. And feel free to submit questions through the chat function. And when you do, please include your affiliation. At the end, we'll get through as many of your questions as we can. I'd like to thank our series sponsors, BCG, FedEx, General Atomics, and IQT, and our series patrons, Chinye Hostler, Sloan Taylor Miller Simmons, Paul Hilal, Marion Cameron Gray, Wick Simmons, and Joel Marcus. And to everyone who's joined us this evening, thank you for supporting the OSS Society. It's now my pleasure to introduce our OSO Social moderator, Dr. Michael Vickers. Dr. Vickers' career as a special operator, a CIA operations officer, a national security policymaker, and an intelligence community leader has spanned the last two decades of the Cold War through a decade and a half of our war with Al-Qaeda, its allies, and offshoots. Service that saw unprecedented senior tenure across Republican and Democratic administrations. More recently, Dr. Vickers served as the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, exercising authority, direction, and control over the National Security Agency, Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, the National Reconnaissance Office, the Defense Security Service, and the intelligence components of the military services and combatant commands. He's received the nation's highest awards in the fields of intelligence and defense. Dr. Vickers has written a memoir that was published last year, by all means available, Memoirs of a Life in Intelligence, Special Operations, and Strategy. The link to purchase Dr. Vickers' book is also in the chat. Dr. Vickers certainly would have met the criteria for what was described as an ideal OSS candidate, a PhD who can handle himself in a bar fight. Due to the virtual nature of today's event, I'm fairly confident there will not be any bar fights. So please welcome Dr. Vickers.
Well, thank you, Charles, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think I should say at the outset that any bar fights I may or may not have engaged in occurred long before I had a PhD, but the compliment is welcome anyway. So this evening, it's our great pleasure to have an old colleague of mine, Lieutenant General U.S. Army retired Charlie Cleveland, for our fireside chat on the American way of irregular warfare. General Cleveland is a graduate of the United States Military Academy, or West Point, and a career Special Forces officer. He commanded at every level of Special Forces units, from detachment to company to battalion, and then the group. And then as a general officer, commanded 2 Theater Special Operations Command, one in Latin America and the second in the Middle East and South Asia, and then culminated his career as commander of all U.S. Army Special Operations Forces as a 3-star or lieutenant general. General Cleveland is also the inaugural recipient of the OSS Society's General Victor Hugo Award, recognizing outstanding contributions to special forces. During the last 8 years of our careers, from 2007 to 2008, General Cleveland and I spent a lot of time together. But as it turns out, we almost crossed paths many decades earlier. General Cleveland's first assignment out of the military academy was as a military intelligence officer supporting the 10th Special Forces Group during the late 1970s and early 80s in the Cold War. And I had served in the 10th Special Forces from 1974 to 1978. So we missed each other only by several months when I went off to officer candidate school. And then General Cleveland's first assignment as a Special Forces officer was also in the unit that I served in as an officer, although we missed each other by 4 years, where he commanded a company, a detachment and a company in the 3rd Battalion, 7th Special Forces Group in Panama, where I had commanded a counterterrorism troop several years earlier. So Charlie, welcome. It's a great honor to have you on the program. So let's start by talking about the term that you've organized your memoir around, irregular warfare. When I was Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Ops, Low Intensity Conflict, and Interdependent Capabilities, as you recall, we published an irregular warfare directive that, among other things, mandated that the department gain as much proficiency or develop as much proficiency in irregular warfare as it did in conventional warfare. And we defined irregular warfare as conflict where at least one of the belligerents is a non-state actor, be it a terrorist, an insurgent, or insurgent. And we could be countering terrorists or countering insurgents or supporting insurgents or resistance movements. But that was the unifying theory. Now, as I understand it, you don't consider counterterrorism as part of irregular warfare. Is that correct, and why?
Well, first of all, Mike, thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting me to be here. I'm honored, really, to participate in this, considering and mindful of the fact that your last guest was a former director of CIA and 4-star theater commander, or commander of 2 theaters, and a combatant commander. So again, I'm not sure what part of the barrel we're scrapping at this point, but I'm glad to be here. First of all, I don't agree that counterterrorism is not part of irregular warfare. I do think it is part of irregular warfare. Actually, I think counterterrorism is really an aspect of counterinsurgency. It's actually, the terrorist organization is in some way an insurgent group of a sort, right? He's got a message. He wants to, and in the fullest term, he wants to actually control territory, as we saw ISIS do there in what, 2014, 2013, that area. So again, where I differ with your definition, and I will admit, okay, because I was pretty far down the food chain when you were promulgating that definition. I don't necessarily know that I didn't agree with it then, but I will be first to say I didn't really get wrapped around the axle on definitions, to be honest with you. And
Yeah.
I don't mean that to be flip. It's just, we got a lot of other things on your plate. There were a lot of angel counting on the head of that pin, if you will, because, and a lot of it for political reasons, right? I'm reminded, the JP1 sort of fight versus the DOD fight. There was a period there where, well, the operative word had to be violent, or whether violent was included or not included.
Right.
And personally, I think that my view on irregular warfare is frankly much broader. It is really that it is a form of warfare, not unlike unconventional warfare. In fact, that's one of the problems with SOCOM listing it as a mission, is that really in its fullest form, it is a form of warfare. It takes a long time to set up, execute, to manage. And so I have a problem with the way SOCOM sometimes sees it in a temporal form as being something you can give a team, shoot them into isolation, and let them go do, right? I mean, you and I both know that would have never, we didn't, that's not the way we did things back in the 10th group, right? Everybody had they had designated areas. We prepared, we did CASMAP, we did sorts of, the planning in detail. And so I kind of see that fuller definition of, like your unconventional warfare, irregular warfare is a form of war. It has multiple lines of effort. It can be lethal in some ways, and at some times it can be not lethal in others. And I think the definitions that both FM30 and JP1 tried to get at almost includes that. I do think that the Army, who has proponency for irregular warfare for DoD, which I find problematic, to be frank with you, it's more convenient and more closely aligned with the Army's traditional purpose to have it include violence in the definition, if you will, as opposed to a form of warfare where the State Department, the intelligence community, others could have dominance in, right? So, but that's the wrangling about definitions. The reality is it is a form of war. It has multiple lines of effort. And frankly, as we need to have practitioners of irregular war who are expert in it and educated in it. And ultimately we need to be world class at it, which means that we have some ways to go. I like a definition that I recently heard from Phil Wasilewski at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He's the director of their Center for Intelligence and Non-Traditional Warfare.
And a former CIA paramilitary operations officer.
Former CIA paramilitary operations officer. And he said, the way they're defining it is a form of warfare by state or non-state groups in which one side fights another to achieve political goals via indirect methods such as insurgency, subversion, terror, and the methods used by the other side to defeat that method. So again, I think it's pretty good.
Yeah. I'd go with that. I mean, that seems very similar.
So.
And in part of it, I mean, I agreed with what you said about counterterrorism. And, part of it was a function of the time where terrorists were blending with insurgents or using terrorist tactics because of our dominance in other areas where they couldn't mass. But not all insurgents, obviously, are extremists. And then some are, as you say, aren't even violent, and you're still waging war against them. And so it's very, very good points. And then I certainly agree with you that irregular warfare done, whether through CIA covert action or our military, is the most likely form of conflict, and also competition, strategic competition and conflict below conventional war. And that includes other things that aren't irregular necessarily: proxy war, indirect conflict, as we see in Ukraine right now, information operations by states against states rather than, targeting a non-state actor or by a non-state actor. And then covert action that isn't irregular, that's, economic sabotage or political action or other things. But it's all important, and it's an area where if you're going to win long-term competitions, that's generally where you've got to win, as well as at the systemic level competition of the strength of your society. So let
me ask you this though, Mike. Let me just, because I do think that, the enemy has a vote in the way you have to conceive the war, right? And so I think that if an enemy declares or has undertaken irregular warfare means against you, whether that be bombarding you with, propaganda, trying to subvert your elections, you can say you are not in a war with them, right? But you can't deny the fact that they are executing potentially an irregular war against you, right?
Yeah,
So
not necessarily a right.
how would you account?
Yeah, I would say, it's because of the closeness, but not direct synonyms of irregular and unconventional or special. Something that is non-traditional. It would be another way of describing the activities you're talking about, whether you call them irregular or unconventional or whatever, or special or non-traditional. They're certainly warfare, and I would
Yeah.
agree with it. They're not necessarily conducted by irregular forces.
So in that framing, that's where when we promulgated at USASOC, as a result of sequestration, the RSOF 2022 series of documents, which I don't know if you remember at the time, kind of was our way to say, hey, how do we get about saving SOCOM somewhere on the order of $250 million in the fight up? We had to come at this. How do we define this problem that we are building a force to go after? And the construct we came up with, and I won't say I came up with it. Frankly, I had a stable of very, very bright young operators from all of the various USASOC tribes that were supporting me in my initiatives group that came up with this. But really, I think it was elegant in as much as that, political warfare is charged a term, and like it or not like it, to me, I think it has relevance. You can call it competitive statecraft, whatever, but it is political warfare. I think DoD's contribution to political warfare, it's nice to say it's irregular warfare, right? You could say that it also includes contributions from the IC, elements in the IC, elements of law enforcement. I would say that, you could say that the counter drug missions down in Bolivia, is that an irregular warfare campaign that we are executing? In my view, I think it was. So, that's the way we framed it. That's the way they framed it. And so with that framing, you then have special warfare being the thing that, and the SEALs didn't like it when we promulgated this in the RSOF 2022 series, but we said, okay, well, special warfare is in fact that portion of the irregular warfare mission that DoD has that SOCOM has to take on. And again, that's the construct. Again, I thought it's pretty simple way to look at it, but that I haven't come off of really kind of that framing just to keep it, in my view, as simple to understand as is necessary. So
Yeah, and I'd agree with that. And then, sometimes units can have both missions. I know in my early days in the 10th group, when we were assigned operational areas in the Soviet bloc and Soviet Union, the most immediate tasks that we had were special reconnaissance and direct action, including, for some of us, me included, with man-portable atomic demolitions, to try to help the fight early on. But since our ultimate goal was to liberate Eastern Europe, and since they could get you in but not necessarily get you out, you
right.
better shift to unconventional warfare. So we called those, and try to build a resistance movement if one didn't exist. So we called that Special Operations Follow-on UW. And, so you can come in a lot of guises. Okay, so I want to get to continue this discussion on two big points. I'd like to you made 6 observations and 3 recommendations in your memoir that cut across your experiences across 3 theaters and almost 4 decades. And one of them is that, and one of the reasons you said you wrote the memoir in the first place is that we had a lot of tactical success, but not strategic success in this area. And I want to challenge that a little bit and get you to talk about it, because while we certainly have had a lot of failures, um, both offensively and defensively across 5 decades, we have had our successes, some of them pretty spectacular. So on the defensive side, Edward Lansdale in the Philippines in the 1950s. And then, as you reference in your memoir, El Salvador and Colombia in Latin America, Colombia being a multi-decade operation. And then on the offensive side, our covert action in Afghanistan, Angola, and even to a certain extent in Nicaragua, all achieved their objectives. Our hybrid campaign in Afghanistan in 2001, and our counterterrorism campaigns against Al Qaeda and ISIS. And it's hard to see those not as successes. Strategic successes?
No, I don't disagree with that.
Um,
I know that, I make the statement, hey, we haven't achieved, but I think I was thinking about maybe some of the larger efforts where we turned what could have been an irregular warfare campaign into a
Sure.
conventional problem, and then that conventional problem led us to not achieving what we had set out to in our strategic objectives. But yeah, no, I agree. El Salvador was a success. Colombia, I think, even with the most recent election, I mean, we'll see what happens if as long as they don't follow the path of Chavez in Venezuela, and let democracy continue to work. It's a success, and certainly your actions, the covert action you participated in, that was a success. Although, again, there are arguments to say, there were second and third order effects that might have created the seed corn for problems that we reaped later. But yeah, no, I don't want anybody to believe that we certainly have done well in pockets and places. The El Salvador adventure, some would say it was, the Congress's 55-man speed limit that helped, keep that, in from becoming bigger than what it needed to be potentially. The effort in Colombia was very unique in as much as it was born with congressional support and executive branch support from the beginning. And then I think that kind of very different sort of collaboration between those two two parts of government made it set the conditions for some tremendous success in Colombia. So yeah, no, it's not all been bad.
Yeah, and then I would say on the counterterrorism side, our campaigns against Al Qaeda, and Al Qaeda is a fragment of what it was, and our campaigns against ISIS were generally pretty successful. Not permanent, but quite successful. The way I look at it is, where we've had success, it's where we've had strategic patience, and generally longer term success has come from an indirect or by, with, and through and smaller footprint approach. When you look at those cases that I said were successes, and then on the defensive side, when you look at the cases that may have been great tactical successes at time, but ended up being strategic failures, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and to a large degree, or to a significant degree, Iraq, it's where we had a larger footprint approach and long duration. And then on the offensive side with covert action, it seems to me where we were in it to win it and had the scale necessary to achieve escalation dominance, we did well. And when we had ill-conceived or half-hearted efforts, we did really stupid things and lost, Bay of Pigs and others. And so I don't know what you think of that, but that's kind of how I look at strategic success and the reasons for it over time, offensively and defensively.
Well, I think what I tried to do in the memoir was, and really, I used just my memoir. I'm not comfortable really with that term, but I just used my experience over time to try to explain, with the benefit of hindsight, to say, okay, what was it perhaps that was going on from what I gathered, lessons and accrued experience from later on. But what I tried to get at was just that we need to be world class at this, and we need to build a capability to be world class. We can't afford, I think, to try to believe that we can take forces or entities built for one thing and just continue to fold, spindle, mutilate, and have them do something else over time. And the thesis really was, okay, it was probably okay through the up to the Vietnam War. You didn't have a lot of public viewing of what it took to do counterinsurgency, for example, in Malaysia. You didn't have the immediate reporting, but starting in Vietnam, you started to see television capture images, bring them back to the United States. The political will in the United States, of course, being affected by that, perhaps helped, along on the outside. And now you have the situation where, with the internet, instantaneous reporting, the problem is even worse. And on top of that, I think it creates a challenge for covert action at scale, kind of what you did. Can we repeat that today, given the visibility that's out there? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. I just would think it's a much bigger challenge today for the folks that replaced you and me to deal with. So it means we need perhaps new thinking, new structures, new concept, if you will. So
Yeah, well, there's certainly long duration conflicts generally, and so you have to plan campaigns accordingly, and you have to adapt to changes in the strategic environment, like increased transparency. But there's ways to hide. There's ways to do espionage operations in the age of AI and cameras everywhere, and there's ways to do covert action. But often you're faced with the choice of trading some secrecy for effectiveness. And that's what we did in Afghanistan. The Soviets knew who was behind it. They just tolerated it at a certain level as long as it, was in intelligence channels and there weren't large numbers of US personnel. So the second thing you talk about, it really comes to organizational recommendations. And that is, you recommend that we have either a cabinet level department or a service within a department, like Marine Corps in the Navy, to do irregular warfare. And you propose creating two SOCOMs, essentially, one for the counterterrorism, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction mission, and the other for special warfare. And a couple of comments on that I'd like to get you to respond to. One is, the OSS that we're here on behalf of tonight with the OSS Society wasn't a cabinet level agency, and it wasn't a service. It was in the War Department. And it certainly had global responsibilities. It was the CIA and SOCOM of its day. But it spawned two organizations, essentially, SOF, that eventually became SOCOM, and CIA. So why do you think we need a service or a cabinet? When we create new cabinets, it doesn't turn out
I
to.
feel like I'm defending my thesis here, Mike. So
well,
Dr. Vick,
I had to suffer through.
Well, let me tell you, Dr. Vick. No,
but
it's a great question. It is a great question. And really, what was proposed, it really is coming from the point of view of, if you do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result, well, then, so what might you do differently? right?
Yeah, yeah.
Now, at the larger level, I said, okay, well, you could recreate perhaps the OSS, gather in the things that have been fragmented to some degree between the agency and DoD and the State Department, and you put them together. And now, where does that rest? Does it rest inside of today's State Department because we're not at war? Do you put it inside of DoD because, well, it could be war? You give it to the Army. I mean, they're the proponents for irregular warfare. How about that? Um, so that's one option would be to say, create something like what the OSS did. And where it goes within the government, personally, I think, uh, cabinet level organization might be best, but I could also see it inside of the State Department or DoD or even at CIA. I mean,
Well,
you
all
know,
of, yeah,
although,
all,
although, although the problem is in each one of those cases, you're diluting the primary purpose of each one of those organizations, right? If you
right.
send it to state, you dilute what state does. If you send it to DoD, it may be more closely aligned with the War Department model that you talk about, but we're at a different kind of war. We're engaged in a different kind of war. Maybe you give it to the CIA, but you already have grumblings that the CIA's purpose has been diluted a bit. It needs to go back less counterterrorism, more intelligence, strategic intelligence gathering.
Yeah, but
So
covert
yeah,
action is bigger than counterterrorism. And, to me, the strength of our system now, I'm more a believer in capabilities and authorities than I am in organizational reforms. But um, CIA's independence, not being tied to a cabinet, is a great strength, and it's something the OSS didn't have. It didn't need it so much because of the relationship between Donovan and Roosevelt. But that independence is important. And then I would say our robust soft community of today is important because it provides capabilities that don't belong in
yeah,
CIA. The irregular warfare is that
yeah.
the Venn diagram. It's that
So that takes me,
common element.
that takes me to then the other recommendation, which
Yeah,
is okay,
so
if you're not gonna do that, okay, which I think I say it in there, which I haven't read the memoir in quite a while.
yeah,
I don't know about you, but once you write it, you don't
you
necessarily
don't
want
want
to
to go
keep
back
going
to it.
back.
I
That's
agree.
right. So anyway, that's why one of the other recommendations was, okay, if you know you're not going to do that because it's just too many oxes going to be gored even going down
Yeah,
that road. Then maybe you look at within the DoD and the joint world structure, have you got it right where you have, JSOC that grew from a 2-star to a 3-star. It's got global responsibilities. It has a very important set of missions that are, no fail, sorts of mission sets. And SOCOM, of course, because that no fail equals oftentimes must fund, that winds up becoming their focus. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but it is. It is what it is. And so the thought was, well, this long-term global irregular warfare campaigning, setting conditions, working with allies and partners, perhaps you need to have, take some of that overhead that's at SOCOM and split those things off. Now, again, there are many reasons not to do that. People hate headquarters, more headquarters, bad. You
right,
know,
right. I was just going to say that.
I would submit to you bad headquarters, bad too. Not that SOCOM's a bad headquarters, but it's
Yeah,
just, again, it is what it is. And
yeah,
so the
yeah.
other the other recommendation, was, again, you could make the case that this branch idea, and somebody else has proposed that where okay, I think Barno actually did. Hey, why don't you take SOCOM and make it, a Marine Corps of the Army, since Army has proponency for irregular warfare, give that whole kit bag back to the Army. Raiding, if you will, is an Army task. All of that kind of stuff. So, there's a case to be made there. The other thing is, if you're not going to do any of that and it's not in the memoir, well, then you should probably consider strong, in my views, a 3-star analog to JSOC that has the TSOCs working for it, with the charge being conducting essentially for the department this global irregular warfare campaigns. Again, that's the way I approached what the TSOC was about. For the longest time while I was at TSOC, we weren't part of SOCOM really. We were, part of the GCC, which was good, had good parts to that. He kind of saw us as his. Then we became part of SOCOM, and of course, that carried with it some goodness. And then it also became you were one of a crowd, and you weren't even in the cool guy club. The cool guy club was over here chasing terrorists.
Yeah.
So again, so to me, do something.
Yeah, the one I actually like,
Or
I'm allergic to more headquarters. We have too many right now and too much overhead. But the second 3-star for kind of the special warfare, that's an operational global command, is the one that I liked. And as we had to settle for dual hatting special forces command, kind of a 2-star, to have a deployable headquarters. And now Navy Special Warfare has followed suit. A few of the other components, I think, are looking at that. But the advantage of a 3-star is then you can compete for JTFs. It doesn't always have to be a conventional commander when you're in an irregular war, in a protracted irregular war in some area. And it would give us more capability. And that one had certainly some appeal to me.
yeah,
Okay.
I mean,
Go ahead.
the bigger problem I have with much of what you just ended with there is that, I mean, it's not about just the commander of the headquarters. It's about having campaign quality irregular warfare headquarters. And just saying the 18th
I
Airborne,
agree. I agree.
and that's the problem, is we don't have any of that, right?
Yeah, well, I would say it's
We have good tactical units, but above that, as much as we hate headquarters, we really haven't designated in a straightforward way and resourced properly, because we really don't have a concept for the conduct of irregular war.
Yeah.
And it's from the concept that you derive the DOTMLs, right? The doctrine, the organization. The organization we have now is based on essentially it's a perversion of kind of the Napoleonic rump thing that was built back in the early 80s, right? When we created the TSOCs. And that was in that period of soft growth. And it looked like every other headquarters. But the problem is irregular warfare has different qualities to it. Operational time is much more extended. The premium on remembering is much higher. On cultivating relationships is much greater. And so we don't have organizations and structures that are properly configured to do the kinds of things that, if we're going to be good at irregular warfare, we need to structure around it. We need to educate every SF officer should go through a PME that's compulsory for making them a better irregular warfare officer. And then PSYOP officer should do the same.
Yeah,
but we don't do that. So we're compromised in all of these things to essentially take a Napoleonic staff, don't really give the mission to the TSOCs to be irregular warfare headquarters. We actually tell them need to be a mini response capability plus this irregular warfare capability. And we don't do either of them then well. And so, again, now maybe it was a fact that I commanded 2 of them and I didn't do them very well, but I think the nation is at a point now where we should get better at this, to include being able to provide better policy options to our decision makers by being good at irregular warfare every day around the globe with a professional force that's dedicated for it.
Yeah, well, and I would say too, I mean, I think the crux of the issue is really expertise, and the more headquarters you have, the more you dilute staffs and you don't get the expertise as well as the overhead. So it's PME and other things that matter, but also besides at the operational level, the 3-star level, besides the tension between conventional headquarters and special operations headquarters, there's also the tension at the 4-star level between the functional combatant commands and the geographic combatant commands. And having worked closely with both models, the DoD model, which is decentralized, regional combatant commands essentially dominate, and they each fight their region, versus the CIA model with a counterterrorism center. Now, again, not all irregular warfare, just counterterrorism, but with global responsibilities. CIA was more effective. I can tell you, across theaters and everything, they could make choices and things that was harder for DoD because you were dealing with different fiefdoms essentially all the time. Okay, so now we're going to take questions in about 10 minutes. So I want to get to current events a little bit. This has been a great discussion, but I want to bring us up to the present a little more. So you're a former SOCCENT commander, Special Operations Command Central, with responsibilities in the CENTCOM AOR, Egypt to Pakistan in those days. What's your feelings about how things turned out in Afghanistan?
Well, again, the seeds for our departure, the way it was, I hate to say it, but I think we're cast early on in the war. I mean, I don't know that any amount of nation building, would have done what was be necessary within a time frame that would have been politically acceptable to the American people. And in the process, you're getting a lot of young sons and daughters killed and maimed, and you're spending a lot of the nation's treasure only to wind up in the same place that you could have been in 2002, perhaps. So I think the question we should ask is, okay, if we knew then what we know now, what would we have done differently? And I personally think that, I use this example when we were standing up the Afghan border police, when you talk to the guys that were in Afghanistan early, we had the border pretty much under some semblance of understanding and control by operating with warlords and tribes. And what was wrong with that model? What caused us to think that it would be better for us to build a centralized, a structure that went back to a central government that was not liked at all by the population in the areas that they were to extend the sovereign's remit? And I think that was the problem. We embarked on that early. I don't know why, but that I think led invariably, and no amount of surge and we're just around the corner and all we need to do is another year. And I personally think that they still had the advantage of they were executing a strategy of exhaustion, a strategy of attrition against us, knowing full well that our democracy, 20 years is a long time. Now, had we kept 2,500 there, would it have made a difference, along with all the contractors keep the aviation flying and so forth? I think the answer is certainly yes. I mean, that would have made a big difference. Could we have sustained that monetarily forever? Probably. Could we have sustained it politically after all that we had gone through had we started that way? I'd say probably. But I'm not sure that the country would have let us continue and add in, forever doing what we were doing there. I don't know. It's counterfactual either way. I think, it's very, very regrettable that the way we left there and left our allies and friends, and it's a blight on frankly, our influence that we're still having to recover from, and I'm not sure we're close to recovering from it. So,
You know, but I mean, ultimately, it's a political decision made at the top levels of our government, and it's based on a frame that why do you have this long stalemated war? You won World War II in 4 years. How come you're not winning this? And it's just a misconception of how long those wars take. And again,
but who explained that misconception to the decision makers at the beginning? I mean, who was in there saying, okay, now General Shinseki said, hey, it's going to take 350,000 troops in Iraq, and he gets fired for it, right?
yeah.
You know, so again, I think we have to, you know, be honest with our senior leaders and try to spell out as much as we can when they're on the bus to Abilene that, you know, this is certainly bad policy.
Yeah. All right. Now, one more question or two more questions, and then we'll open it up. So, continuing with our Middle East theme, we have the Israel Hamas war that's past 6 months now, and with extensions into other parts of the Middle East. As former SOCCENT commander, what are your thoughts on that?
Oy, oy vey, as they would say.
As they would say.
You know, honestly, the people, you know, the people are going to pay for the sins of their king. And Hamas was elected into power. Now, obviously, they distorted the instruments of power to stay in power. But the people, you know, unfortunately, are suffering now because the Israelis are, in my view, having to do what the Israelis have to do. This is, you know, this is unfortunately a consequence of probably multiple wars that were stopped before a culmination. And what happens in that case is you freeze the problem continues to grow, and you then have a repeat of the problem. So I'm all for the Israelis, you know, taking every bit of care and caution to figure out how to do it, but they've got to finish the job. That means going into Rafah. That means do what they've got to do there. I would hope that the Arab nations in the area will do everything they can to relieve suffering of the people, you know, and then help take a look at what a longer term solution to this will be. But that long term solution cannot be an Iranian proxy. And that's, I think, the bigger problem here is that, you know, how long do we let, you know, a regional hegemon who has declared that it is, you know, its purpose is to destroy Israel and frankly, it would do the same to the United States if it had some reach, but certainly is threatening our allies and interests in the region. You know, how long do we put up with that? That's back to my point is they've declared irregular war on us. They're using proxies. In my view, we ought to give them some of their own medicine.
Yeah.
You know, I'd personally be full court press to figure out what kind of irregular warfare means and be very proactive at taking it to them. And be unabashed about it, right? I mean, but yeah, it's unfortunate, but you know, this is the people paying for the sins of their kings.
Okay, last question, then I'm going to ask some on behalf of the audience that I've received.
Do we have an audience? I can't tell.
We do.
Anybody out there?
Yeah, they're out there. So, as a former senior SOF officer, state of SOF today.
I mean, I am not as close to the, you know, current community as to really answer that question, you know, fully. My sense is, you know, we're going through one of those inevitable periods that all parts of the get hit with. You know, it's not unlike when sequestration hit us in 2011, 2012 timeframe, and we had to save money, and so SOF is having to pay a bill. But by all reports, the young men and women who are signing up and coming into the business, the Special Forces Regiment, the PSYOP Regiment, the Ranger Regiment, they're every bit as good as they've ever been, and they're probably a damn sight better than you and I would ever admit to, you know, not being probably. So I think our strength will always be in the young men and women who raise their hand to come into this work. The whole purpose of my trying to, you know, proposing an IW center to study, educate, push education within the department, within the joint force, make it compulsory for at least a sliver of the joint force so that they are, no kidding, expert at it. Is it so we don't abuse them? And I don't like watching these Tunnel to Towers commercials where these young men are waiting for a house, and that one young man says, and here's the list, and it's a long list. And then the other young man says, yeah, maybe too long. Okay. Maybe that list was too long because we weren't very smart on the way we fought those wars. And I was part of that problem. Okay. I was one of the senior leaders that you refer to. And I want to make sure we do everything we can not to repeat that. We should have a better organization. I know we don't like headquarters, but we should be organized better. We need to break down the silos in between departments if we have to become better at it. A lot of sacred cows out there that need to be made into sacred hamburger, okay, to develop what's needed for the future. And I don't propose to know what the answer is. I only know that you have to begin the journey of discovery with an open mind and be ready to make the changes that are necessary so that you're protecting America's young people when you ask them to go to these kinds of, you know, commit themselves to these kinds of wars.
All right, so now I've got a few questions from the audience. So first, how do you see the role of psychological operations forces or military information support, as we call them, a euphemism these days, in your broader concept?
They are an integral part to special warfare and irregular warfare. I think personally part of this 3,000 person cut, and I understand that it's going to hit the PSYOP community heavy. Although I don't think they've actually decided yet, so I think there's still hope out there. At least that's the last rumor I heard. But I think that the Army would do well if they're indeed the proponent for irregular warfare. Would be to say, okay, instead of, if you're going to cut some of these assets out of the SOCOM formation, the USASOC formation, some of them ought to reappear in the conventional units and in the conventional formations, because those conventional units need to have that sort of capability as well. You know, they're part and parcel to the irregular, the information operations community. And those two together, frankly, are necessary in conventional warfighting as they are in special warfare. But I see the PSYOP communities central to, you know, to who we are. I personally believe in a human domain, right? I think land, sea, air, cyberspace. Did I miss one? You know, all of them, all those are important. But I think the reason why we struggle with the PSYOP community and its place is emblematic of this bigger problem of frankly, those domains don't adequately describe the capabilities that are needed to fight and win in what I think really is this emerged human domain, right? And I use the example, you know, air was a domain. It was always a domain. It was always a place, right? You know, the balloons and biplanes, but they made it a domain when they realized that your military campaign would fail if you didn't have forces designed to actually dominate in that space. The same things happen with human terrain. In this multimedia, immediate information world, you need to have forces that are dedicated to the human domain. It's no longer human terrain. It is, no kidding, a domain in and of itself, where cultural understanding of history, where the ability to speak a language, where the ability to use indigenous forces, the ability to reach in and influence, with messaging, target populations is critical. And so yeah, overlong answer, but yeah, to me, it's central. It's a key part of what I think is, missing, which is the human domain construct added to our other domains so that we can build the right kind of, forces for that domain.
So related question from some of our audience members is, what about cyber? We've had states trying to attack our will and unity through information operations, sometimes enabled by cyber. We've had non-state actors conducting acts of sabotage using cyber means against U.S. infrastructure. What are your thoughts on that as part of your broader irregular warfare concept?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And there was a time, somebody early on, when the human domain idea was bouncing around out there, that, maybe cyber and human need to combine. Maybe it is this, a combined sort of thing. But cyber really is a pathway to the brain, right? Of the various populations out there. That's one aspect of it. Now, it's also a pathway to our command and control systems, to vital weapon systems. And so I can very much see it as an analogous to artillery, if you will, in the electronic space. But I can also see it as a very important component for reaching in to talk to and manipulate or influence populations. So I think a part of cyber is very much a part of irregular warfare. But I think it's also, just like airplanes and some of these other things that cross over to all forms of warfare, it's ubiquitous.
Yeah, I mean, cyber is uniquely a powerful collection tool, unlike a lot of force applications. It's an
Yeah.
irregular tool. It's a conventional force tool for theater commanders and a strategic one, which is why Cybercom originally was under Stratcom, and then there was too many layers given the speed of cyber, and so we broke it out separately. So
This
now,
is like, just the human domain thing again. Unfortunately, we brought up the human domain, right, in our very first draft of 3.05 in 2011, and the Marine Corps automatically non-concurred. And again, very shortly after, you see Admiral Mullen, pushing for, his domain. And then you see President Trump later come down with his domain, which was space. And human domain had no champion such as that. I mean, it was just a, little old us down there saying, okay, this is part of the problem. I personally think we're eventually going to get there, because the reality is these sorts of threats are not going away.
yeah.
And the inadequacy of the apparatus we built for these threats is going to become increasingly evident. So,
Well, I mean, I said before, I don't like more headquarters, but I'm glad we created a cyber command. I'm glad we created a space force. We've got a ways to go, and a space command separate from strategic command.
so you selectively like new
I
headquarters.
selectively like some new ones,
Okay,
not
so
too
okay,
many,
got
and
you
I want to, for balance, I want to get rid of or consolidate some of these we have already. I think we have too many regional commands and others. But, I used to point out to my Air Force colleagues when they would say air and space is a continuum, I would say, well, isn't space kind of the absence of air? I mean, so probably deserves its own domain. And now it's critical to war fighting. Okay, so I have one from a student, I think, at Texas A&M's Bush School that says in intelligence studies, we learn 8 covert action tenets, core concepts, which a successful covert action must adhere to. And as I read this, I'm thinking of my good friend Greg Vogel, who's a professor down there. So he's doing his job. It's
So I'm
obvious.
going to let you answer his question, Mike.
Well, no. It gets
This
to
one's
you.
in your sweet spot here. Go
No,
ahead.
it actually pivots here, and it says the questioner asks not about covert action, but what would you lay out as tenets for successful irregular warfare?
Oh,
So I could answer,
So-
but I'm going to make you answer.
so with that, I want to draw the attendees' attention to the internet and RSOF 2022 and 2022 Part 2, which are readily searchable on the internet. You can take a look at what I have to say about irregular warfare in that. But the tenets, I used to use a shorthand, which was, go small, go early, go long, and what was the other one? Anyway, there was 4 of these. They aren't really tenets, but the idea is in irregular warfare, if you can, you stay as small as necessary. It's kind of the Heisenberg principle of, that as soon as you're going to be there, you're going to affect the environment, right? So if you think you're going to measure the atomic activity, you're going to impact it, right? So it's the same thing in some of these conflicts. The bigger your footprint.
I'm just finishing a paper on quantum computing's impact on national security. So with this Heisenberg stuff,
there you go.
There you go.
So that's, I think, go long and go early, right? If you're going to engage in these things, you've got to be there well ahead of time. In fact, that's why you can look around the world and know what areas matter to us. And so we should be establishing the right kind of footprint relationship, call it what you will, in those areas to create optionality. Now, the Defense Department hates that because it's a presence mission, and they don't like presence missions. But because everybody's too busy and we have other things to do. But if you go back to the principle that Mike and you and I enjoyed in 10th group at the early days, you had an area, you would go to that area, you would learn that area. If it was a stay behind area, you got to know all the things that were relevant about that area so that you could do your job. So I think we ought to be doing the same thing around the globe. And that's what I think that, this global approach to irregular warfare would kind of entail. What matters to us? Where does it matter? What kind of footprint can we have there? What kind of relationships do we need to cultivate there? I was SOCCENT commander, a CA troop came up and said, hey, we're going into Djibouti. We're going to drill a well in Djibouti. And I just rhetorically turned to my staff and I said, okay, well, how many wells have we dug in Djibouti? And of course, nobody knows the answer. They didn't know because we don't remember that, but we should, right? And we should know who we talked to. And we should know if the guy liked Americans or didn't like Americans. Did he have a kid? Did he have kids that like to hang out with, the team and like to shoot? Did he drink Chivas Regal or Johnny Walker or whatever, right? But all of that information is ephemeral for us. It goes away because we go on to the next event. But that stuff is key in irregular warfare. And we are giving away advantage because we're not organized to remember, right? So go long means that if you're going to commit to it, it's going to take a while to be there. And so those are, if you will, kind of tenets. And Dave Maxwell, I'm sure, is on here, and Dave will pipe up with whatever the 4th go was. I keep remembering, it's go long, go. Anyway.
Go local. So it just
go local. Yes,
forgot,
go local.
Dave put it in the chat.
Good.
Principle of
Thank
special
you,
warfare.
Dave.
Early, go small, go local, go long.
Exactly.
Something you said at NDU in November 2015 after you retired. So just in case in your dotage you forgot, he was helping you out.
Thank you. Yeah, I
Did a
did.
good
Thanks.
job. All righty. Well, I think we're, I guess one final question from a retired senior special operator is you talked about, a service that maybe AS and Mark Mitchell and Dave Maxwell have talked about as well, elevating ASD Solic to a higher level. The question is, should SOCOM, which combines service-like responsibilities and combatant command uniquely responsibilities, should it be a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff?
Hmm. I would say, why not? I mean, you would probably know better than I would, but I do think that the voice at the table that represents this whole aspect of warfighting is vacant. I mean, who are you depending on to give you now? Again, you're asking your geographic combatant commanders who grew up in a world of conventional warfighting to perhaps who came to irregular warfighting when they became geographic combatant commanders in many cases, most of them. Maybe that's not fair. Some of them probably maybe came from our community. Joe Votel was an exception, okay, hugely talented for the position he was in. But by and large, I think that whole aspect of warfighting, frankly, isn't represented. And if it in fact is the thing that we do more often than not, more than conventional warfighting, more than certainly fighting with nukes, it should probably somebody should have a literate voice at the table for it. So yeah, I'm all for it,
Yeah,
assuming that.
I mean, I think that expertise problem is critical at top levels of government, from my service experience. And, unfortunately, one of the casualties of Goldwater Nichols has been a reduction of influence of the Joint Chiefs as a body, elevating the chairman to senior military advisor, creating a vice chairman that handle, a lot of the White House meetings, and then elevating the combatant commanders. And so when a secretary or a president is getting advice, it's typically coming from, of course, the secretary, but also the chairman or vice, as it may be, and a combatant commander, and the chiefs of the services who theoretically have the real domain expertise, are usually not included. And, my experience in the Cold War, as a younger officer, but seeing senior levels of the military up close when I was at CIA with Afghanistan, the joint and the invasion of Grenada, for example, the Joint Chiefs were important as a source of advice as a collective body. Anyway, Charlie, we're out of time. It's been wonderful chatting with you. Brings back a lot of good memories. And thanks for joining us this evening. Charles, over to you.
And on behalf of the OSS Society and everybody who tuned in this evening, I want to thank Dr. Vickers and Lieutenant General Cleveland for sharing their time and their wisdom with us tonight and for their selfless service to our nation. And of course, with such a great thought-provoking discussion tonight, they're still serving our nation. And I also want to thank everybody who took the time to watch the conversation. We'll make it available online shortly. We hope you can join us for the next installment on our Oh So Social Conversation series, when Dr. Vickers will be speaking with Dmitry Alperovich about his forthcoming book, World on the Brink: How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. Mr. Alperovich is the co-founder and chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator, a nonprofit focused on advancing American prosperity and global leadership in the 21st century and beyond. He is a co-founder and former CTO of CrowdStrike, a leading cybersecurity company, a renowned cybersecurity visionary, business executive, and thought leader on geopolitics, great power competition, and cybersecurity strategy. Alperovich has served as a special advisor to the Department of Defense and currently serves on the Department of Homeland Security Advisory Council and the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency's Cyber Safety Review Board. His writing on geopolitics, foreign policy, and cybersecurity issues has appeared in major news outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Foreign Affairs. and he's a regular contributor to national broadcast news programs, including the PBS NewsHour and NBC News. And as soon as we set a date for this conversation, everybody who joined us tonight will get an invitation to it. So thank you again for joining us this evening, and good night.